Welcome back once again to This Week in Christian History. And this week's deep dive episode is on the Council of Nicaea. And we have our guest this week is Dr. Blair Smith, who is the president of the Charlotte campus of Reformed Theological Seminary. Do I have that right, Dr. Smith? The Charlotte campus? Do you say it that way, or does
Yeah,
the
that's
RTS at
right.
Charlotte, or how do we say that?
RTS Charlotte's fine.
Okay, all right. It'll work. You still get the mail, right? I mean,
That's right.
it still will come your direction to be able to. So, thanks for making time for us today and to
Yeah, my
talk a little
pleasure.
bit more. So,
Yeah.
the Council of Nicaea, for maybe people who might not be as knowledgeable about the council itself, but on kind of a scale of, I don't know, 1 to 10, 10 being the highest and 1 being being the lowest. This council of all the church councils and others is way up the list, right? I mean, it gets a whole bunch of points, right? Just because it's the first
Yeah.
one, or because of the theology, or let's jump into what all that means. So is that a fair
Ye-
question?
Yeah, I would say it's probably the most important. That could be because it's the first one. It's what's known as this first ecumenical council, which is a council with representatives from the known world, which is primarily the Roman Empire at the time. It certainly has a high stature because of the creed that it produced, that Christians throughout the world have used in worship from the time of the council all the way to present. The council was in 325. I think Constantine and his stature within the Roman Empire has certainly elevated the reputation and the pivotal nature of the Council of Nicaea. And of course, Constantine was an emperor, and he became an emperor at a very pivotal time in the empire where Christianity was on the rise, and he became a Christian and made Christianity licit, whereas previously it was an illegal religion and was under persecution at a variety of times and places. So those are all important reasons, and it dealt with a theological issue, of course, which comes out in the creed that it produced. That was a significant issue among Christians, and because Christians were growing at that time, it was a significant issue in the empire. And so, yes, very important. Could be argued, I think, the most important of the creeds, because so many of the subsequent creeds actually look back to Nicaea in many ways in foundational doctrine. So, for example, just to give an example, the second ecumenical creed is AD 381, which is the Council of Constantinople. And it, in a sense, goes back to Nicaea, represents Nicaea more or less, and then makes some additions. And then the subsequent councils continue to look back to Nicaea as foundational for the doctrine of the church. And as the church deals with further theological issues, it sort of builds on this fundamental structure that's given in Nicaea.
Excellent. Right. So let's talk about what was the theological kind of reason to ding the bell, right? I mean,
Yeah.
or to do the call, right? And that ultimately is kind of what we would call the Arian controversy, right? Or the Arius
Yeah.
theology, or what's the right way to say that?
Yeah, that's right. Arius is the man whose teaching was under question in the Council of Nicaea, and the legacy of his teaching, in a sense, became known as Arianism. And we can talk about why it became Arianism. That was largely due to a church father by the name of Athanasius, who associated subordinationism of the Son to the Father within the Trinity with Arianism. But Arius was a man, and he was condemned at the council. The council had some anathemas, and Arius in his teaching was anathematized at the council. But who was Arius? I think that was your question. He was a presbyter, so he had a church position at the time prior to the council in Alexandria, which of course is in northern Africa. And he had a debate with his bishop. His bishop in Alexandria, was Alexander. So this can get confusing. So Alexander of Alexandria. Now, Alexander of Alexandria was teaching a doctrine which according to Christians and according to me, is a biblical doctrine, but it got theological heft through a previous century theologian by the name of Origen of Alexandria. And the doctrine is of the eternal generation of the Son, so that the Son is eternal and the Son is eternally coming forth, generated from the Father. So he was teaching this doctrine. He had a phrase, always Father, always Son. So if there's always a Father, he's an eternal Father because he's God. He's always had a Son. And Arius objected to his bishop's teaching. And in objecting to his teaching, the church became very concerned, at least locally initially in Alexandria, and they had a local synod which condemned Arius, and he was deposed from his office. But the theological issue of the relationship between the Son and the Father in the Trinity was a big one. Arius had a lot of supporters. Whether they went as far as his teaching or not, he had a lot of supporters. And so this was a significant question in the church and in the empire. And he had a lot of people that were thinking along his same lines. Now, what was he thinking? Well, he objected to the idea of the eternality of the Son. So he believed that the Son was created. We are created human beings. The world is created. So if you have like an ontological map between uncreated and created, he put him on the created side of the ontological map. At the same time, he had this space in ontology between fully God and created. And so he believed the Son was created, but he was created before the world, and he was divine in some way, just not as fully divine as the Father. So he did not share in divine being in the full sense that the Father did. He was created by the Father. He even had a role in creation of the world, but there was a time when he was not. This became the famous phrase associated with Arius and his teaching. It was a phrase that was actually condemned at the Council of Nicaea, that they condemned this phrase. There was a time when he, that is the Son, was not. So that's a little bit about Arius. He was a significant figure going into the council. His teaching was a significant figure surrounding the council. I would say after the council, he as a person was not a significant figure per se, but his legacy, his teaching certainly lived on in various ways.
So what's because there's so many moving parts to all this, right? I mean, there's so many intersecting things. There's the whole conversation about, why does the emperor have to be the one to call everybody together for church business, right? I mean, why isn't this just church business, okay, on its own? You've got Athanasius, who is a fellow presbyter, right? A preacher on the other side of town, right? That is also there. You've got him writing the Easter message about, these are the books of the Bible and other things that Athanasius does. You've got the bishop involved, and you've got all of this stuff, right, going on all of that. But then the other idea about this doctrinal piece is, I guess when there were heresies at the time that the apostles were still around, Paul could strike out a letter, right, and go, hey, let me tell you, this is wrong. This heresy is off chart. This is not right. Here's what this is about. Or he wanted to be able to talk about, any number of those things that were heretical, that he wanted to make sure we got our doctrine straight. But the last time I checked, 325, Paul wasn't around, right? And neither was. So what do you do when there are these major theological questions, this one being a huge one about the Trinity and Jesus being fully part of all of that? That's a bit, right? And so is the council is really kind of the only way they thought they could get that together? I know this is a loaded 15-part question, but
the known world in one sense, you think of the Roman Empire of the time. It had its own organization, and some of that organization was a little bit in flux at this time. But the emperor, of course, had that ability to pull together people from both sides, East and West. He also had funds, access to be able to gather in one place, bring leaders of the church together. He had, there's some debate of his own personal faith. I don't think this is probably the podcast to get into that. But he had professed Christianity. He had an interest in this question that could have been personal, but certainly he had an interest in the question on a leadership level because Christianity was growing, because the church was growing. The question of the unity of the church really affected the unity of the empire. And so he had definite concern there. Whereas, what was his exact theological concern? Debate about that. But certainly church leaders had significant questions about the theology of this. And I think Constantine's, he knew he wasn't a theologian. He needed advisors, and he wanted to call on those that were trained in scripture, trained in theology, to be able to discuss and debate this question and make some decisions. And so it was an ecumenical council. It had, there were hundreds there, by tradition, 318, there's debates exactly how many were there of leaders of the church, but they came, they discussed, they produced a creed, they supported certain teaching about the Son's relationship to the Father, which they believed was expressive of biblical revelation, and then condemned that which they saw as contrary to that, which was heretical. And so it created boundaries going forward, boundaries which were the boundaries of orthodoxy for good teaching for the church that united the church, and the church could come together and say, this is what we believe, we're going to confess this, and this is going to unite us. We might have some distinctions based on all kinds of factors, but we can say this unites us, and the whole church has come together to do this. And at the same time, we're rejecting this, so that if you are steering over here, you're outside of what is Christian teaching. And it's undeniable Constantine, from a leadership perspective, had a crucial role in convoking the council, pulling it together. He was there, but he certainly had theological advisors and those that were leadership of the church that were contributing to the overall conversation. And one of those that was present, but was not a bishop at the time, was the one you mentioned, Athanasius. So Athanasius was theological secretary, we could think of him in some ways, to his bishop, Alexander, who was present there. But certainly Athanasius was present, and his voice really grew after the council in defending the clause, the key theological clause of homoousios, that the Son is of the same substance as the Father.
And that's what you really smart seminary people talk about is there's really just an I, right, between one word and another word that kind of throws it in a different way in the Greek or something like that. I can't recall it, but it just I know that it's in there, right? But it's in there, right? And so
well, the I, the iota, yeah, that's a later kind of is he like the Father, or is he of the same substance? Later on, there became a group known as the Homoousians, who said he was of like substance with the Father. That wasn't really a debate at the council itself. That's really a later debate, but there's been a lot of historians that have muddled that picture and kind of put it back into the council itself. The council was dealing with Arius and his sort of radical views.
Got you very much. Hey, we're enjoying our conversation with Dr. Blair Smith, and we are unpacking so many components and pieces of what is the Council of Nicaea, and we're enjoying our conversation about that. And I guess I will put myself in someone who read up on some of the muddled historians. So that's why I enjoy being able to put me in the muddled group, okay? But I'd like to be in the unmuddled group. So, but when it actually came to a vote, right, of those presents, and Arius got a pretty good spanking, right? I mean, it wasn't like it wasn't even close, was it?
No, it wasn't close. A few might have been on his side, or a few were uncomfortable with the anathemas against him, but it was overwhelming support of the creed, which language affirmed that the Son was of the same divinity, eternal, light of light, God of God, homoousios, with the Father. This is what the creed confessed positively, which goes against and cuts against Arius's teaching, and then it negatively, actively condemned him and his teaching. as well. So it really sought to go to the root of the issue and affirm the Son's full divinity in relation to the Father, and simultaneously reject the idea that the Son was created. So any kind of subordinationism of the Son to the Father is what it was trying to deal with.
And so from that, though, is where we get the Nicene Creed, right? Which, of course, as you were saying, has been tweaked and moved around. And this is not a podcast on the all the creeds, because we have a big series on all of that, right?
Yeah.
But part of was part of the idea of, hey, if this kind of heresy is still rolling around out there, to use those of us that are old enough to have watched Andy Griffith, right, to be able to say, since you're in North Carolina, right, we could say that, right? Barney
Yeah.
Fife is saying we're going to need to nip this thing in the bud, right? We need to
Mhm.
make sure that there's not any more dialogue going on around that. You have this coming out of the edict against the Christians, right? That which is
Mhm.
a previous podcast episode for anybody who's watching that we did about 7 or 8 episodes ago. We're coming out of all of that. What does it really mean to be a Christian? What is it not? We got all these other people who've been hiding. Now they're back in. I mean, all these pieces. We just got to get this down on a, and I'm using obviously simple language, but we got to be able to put this thing down on a piece of paper. We need to
Mhm.
make sure that when anybody says that they are a Christian, or they know what they're getting into, they understand what this is all about, and you are affirming this. And so,
Yeah.
you know, it's not just the Arianism, right? But there's also kind of a practical piece to that maybe
Mhm.
comes to the creed. Did I
Yeah, for sure.
answer my own question? But
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think, people that look at Constantine, they really wonder, okay, how much theology was he really concerned about and interested in? Perhaps it was really the practical question. And if you got these Christians who are becoming a significant part of the empire, and he himself was confessing, bickering over this, it had real practical effect of division. And so a creed brings them together. Now, as your listeners will know, history is often not that simple. And just because things are decided upon a council does not unity make necessarily, because you have people from different backgrounds, different theological maybe trajectories, and two, key languages, Latin and Greek. And just because they had the council doesn't mean everyone immediately understood all the theology of the council. So specifically the word homoousios, which is sort of the defining word of the council, that the Son is homoousios, which in Greek is of the same substance as the Father. Not everyone immediately precisely knew what that meant. It had some baggage from the background, and so it was open to a little bit of interpretation. And so negatively, yes, the council rejected Arius and his teachings, but on a more positive going forward, the use of the word homoousios actually opened a lot of questions. And so the church really wrangled over this for, half a century still. Athanasius was a key part of that conversation. Some other church fathers who are dealing with, okay, how do we precisely understand this word? A variety of different parties came to the surface, some more radical, some more open to dialogue and coming together. And so even though 325 was very pivotal and set the foundation, there's still subsequent creeds, including 381, the Council of Constantinople, which uses the Nicene Creed and builds on a little bit, because there had been a lot of theological discussion between 325 and 381.
wow. And emperors changed, right? And
Oh
so
yeah.
Athanasius would be on the good side, then he'd be on the bad side, then he'd be on
Yep.
the run, and this one said,
Yep.
"Oh no, I think we ought to go back that way." So you've got this whole kind of political component to it, if you will, in the middle of all this theological piece. And so,
Mm-hmm.
you know, um,
Yeah.
other than Jesus telling us that the church was going to be built and we could know it was coming, I mean,
Yeah.
you would wonder if we were trying to do it on our own, right? What it would
Yeah.
have been like,
Yeah.
right? Who knows, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Probably
Yeah.
not
No,
great.
it was the emperors after Constantine, and even Constantine himself would sometimes send off some conflicting messages and actions, but they ebbed and flowed. As you mentioned with Athanasius, he was exiled 5 different times. Now, he was a difficult figure. Some of that was the emperor, maybe some of that was himself. But Christianity was licit during this whole time, but there was a variety of different theologies that were in the ascendancy. But then Christianity becomes the religion of the empire under Theodosius's leadership, and he is important for the Council of Constantinople I mentioned earlier in 381. And it could be argued the theology really gets clarified and solidified by the time you get to the end of the 4th century, at least close to the end of the 4th century, with that council in 381, which is known as the Second Ecumenical Council.
A lot of stuff moving around, right?
Yeah.
A lot of good ideas and thoughts. Well, thank you so much for spending some time for us to learn more about this. Of course, we are using the date of May 20th, 325 is the date that I think that the call went out, right? I don't think it was the date that they actually showed up in Nicaea, or maybe I may have that backwards, but we're using that as the date as the way for us to be able to talk about it. So we're going back.
Very good.
That. So Dr. Blair Smith, who is the president at the Reformed Theological Seminary, Charlotte, has been our guest today, and we're very grateful for your time. Thank you.
Very happy to be on. Thank you.
Okay.